Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom and our discussion of 19th century Europe, right? We have been talking a lot about 19th century Europe in this last unit and stuff like that, talking about the Industrial Revolution, talking about all the political isms that are on the rise, and talking about the fallout of the French Revolution and how Europeans are going to handle this whole thing, focusing in on the Congress of Vienna, focusing in on the division of land, focusing in on the issues that Clemens von Metternich's going to have to deal with, oh no, people want more rights. Yeah, what a terrible thing, right, Clemens? Idiot. Now, the big thing about it, though, in general, though, is we actually left off with something that was going on in the background of this entire unit, right? We were talking about Romanticism in class today, really focusing in on the writers, right? We were focusing in on what's going on with Victor Hugo, his Hunchback of Notre Dame story, and the really crazy, love quadrangle that's going on in it between Quasimodo, Count Frollo, Phoebus, and Esmeralda, and all this stuff. Now, everybody's in love with Esmeralda, but Esmeralda's not in love with everybody else, and everybody dies, right? So, now, look, the big thing about it, though, as well, we talked about the Count of Monte Cristo, right? Manasseh, right? Big shout out right there. Big fan of the Count of Monte Cristo. Awesome little interpretations in The Great Gatsby that are there as well. Cannot wait to watch that movie with y'all. It's going to be a great time after we take the AP exam, right? Now, speaking of the AP exam, this unit is heavily tested on the AP exam, and it's really heavily tested because it's such a turning point in history, right? Art took a dramatic turning point. Political isms took a dramatic turning point. The Industrial Revolution and manufacturing economics, dramatic turning point, right? And things would never be the same after the 1800s in Europe. So really quickly, we're going to kick off and keep going with what we're talking about with the change in art, right? So we started talking about Romanticism in writing. I skipped over poetry just because I don't like poetry that much. But you can look up some. I'll post a romantic poem to the Google Classroom. It's William Wordsworth's I Walked as Lonely as a Cloud. And it talks about him laying in a field of daffodils instead of looking at a factory, right? So it's a big thing about it to understand that romanticism was also emphasized in poetry as well. But the visual arts is where it was much more prominent, okay? Now looking at these two paintings, you already know these aren't romantic. These are Rococo and Baroque, right? Look at the pastels, the love, the little fluttering little things in the background, the man who's just so forlorn for the woman on the swing and the pastel pink and the boy in blue and the blah, blah, blah. So the thing about it, though, in general, is that's Rococo and Baroque art, right? Soft, beautiful. And then also Rococo or Baroque art inside of the Palace of Versailles, grandiose, really big, all on the ceiling. Wow, right? So the number one thing about this is when you're looking at the creation and inception of all this stuff, it's important to keep in the back of your mind that romantic art is not going to follow those lines. Romantic art, on the other hand, is going to be a massive transition, right? Really quickly, you do not need to write any of these artists' names down. It's much more about identifying the art when you see it. This, for example, Eugene Delacroix is a very famous romantic artist. This is his famous Lady Liberty Leading the People, right? So what's going to happen? Spoiler alert. There's going to be another French Revolution. There's actually 2 or 3 of them actually on the way that we'll talk a little bit about in this class as well. So the thing about it is some of you are another French Revolution. We just got done with the other one. I thought Maximilian was dead. Robespierre is still dead, right? Still very much dead. Still very much shot in the face. Now, the thing about it, though, is they're going to be some little baby revolutions that happen in France, mainly focused in Paris. And Eugene Delacroix is trying to romanticize one of those pieces right here, right? So this one, of course, is it's emphasized off the Revolution of 1830, right? So this is Lady Liberty Leading the People, because literally you have the personification of liberty, or Lady Liberty, the woman that literally the Statue of Liberty is based off of, leading people through a scene of dead and forlorn bodies and stripped figures in front of them, trying to show that the people will actually march over the doom and go forward and lead its people into new glory, right? Very romantic and intense. This one right here is a massacre scene from the Greek War of Liberation that Eugene Delacroix did, and it shows the Ottoman Turks overseeing a massacre of Greek people and stuff like that, and we'll talk more about this scene a little bit later on, kind of reference back to this because the Greeks are going to successfully liberate themselves from Ottoman control, and that became a very romantic cause in Europe, by as in, let those Greeks go, and all this other stuff, right? So going into it, though, this is one of Eugene Delacroix's most famous pieces. This is called the Death of Sardinopolis. Now, this is my favorite Delacroix piece, okay? Now, this is very romantic, though, because it's so intense and violent and vile and stuff like that. In the sense of, the focal point is this huge red bed, this dead woman, but mainly the man sitting on top of the bed, right? His name is Sardinopolis. Sardinopolis was an Assyrian king way before Christ was ever even born, when the Assyrians controlled what is now known as the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia/Iraq, right? So the thing about it, though, is Sardinopolis was in the middle of a war, his city was being sieged, and he was going to be taken prisoner, and he was going to die. Rather than doing that, he literally takes all of his gold and all all of his wealth and all of his things, and he literally puts them on a funeral pyre and he burns himself to death along with all of his goods. But also in the story, what he also does is he takes his concubines, which are his women, and then also his male eunuch servants, which are these guys right here, and also all of his things, and he burns it along with them, killing all of them in the process, right? So Eugene Delacroix tried to represent this, which also, Sardinopolis was a Byron play, a Lord Byron play. Lord Byron wrote a play about the story, and Eugene Delacroix did a painting of that same story. And there are 6 different women that are being brought in front of Sardinopolis that are all being slain in the process, also his goods, his horses, and all of his other things. Death, tumultuous intensity. Speaking of death, Theodore Gercald's Raft of the Medusa is another really, really good example of romantic art. As you can see, what happened on this, the Raft of the Medusa was a very large ship that was on its way to Senegal, right? And it actually started sinking. And to try and save themselves, 150 people clambered onto a small raft where they sat out in the middle of the ocean for over several weeks, right? Now, the thing about it was, though, is they actually got into several fights and ended up killing each other and stuff like that. And you can see the writhing and the pain and the intensity in all of their forms and anguish as they're trying to signal a boat so far off in the distance, right, to save themselves. And they want to save themselves rather than save each other, because look at them pulling and gouging and scraping at everything. That's romantic art, right? Joseph N. W. Turner, one of my favorite romantic artists, right? This is, of course, Rome at Dawn. This is the one that you've seen on my like board that we talked about, the Fighting Tamari. Of course, the industrial tugboat towing away the beautiful old ship on the line. The ways of the world are now dying out. Caspar David Friedrich, another very famous romantic artist. He's a very good, glorious views of nature type of artist. And this is, of course, him, Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. Not the Ang one that we put in there, but I am a big fan of the Ang one. But Francisco Goya is one of the other most famous ones as well. This is actually a famous painting of his called The Executions of May the 3rd. And the Executions of May, this is literally is Napoleonic soldiers shooting rebels from Spain during the Peninsular War, right? That were actually the guerrillas that were jumping, or that were actually doing guerrilla warfare onto the Napoleonic armies. They're ousting them out of villages and having them shot. This one is called in the Yard of the Fools, or in the yard, so basically what this is it's actually, it's in the Yard of the Lunatics, right? This is actually Francisco Goya went into an insane asylum and actually observed what was going on and actually painted them being let out for exercise, okay? And then, of course, this one, Francisco Goya's most famous piece, is, of course, Saturn devouring his child, right? The intensity, the violence, right? So yes, but that really quickly, though, is romantic visual art, right? So now what we're going to do, though, is we're going to change gears again, and we're going to talk about some stuff that's going to happen in the mid-19th century into the end of the 19th century, right? There's going to be a series of reforms and revolutions that are going to go down that are going to drastically change the trajectory of European history, right? So they're going to range from about 1830 to 1848. Now, I'm going to give you kind of like a little table of contents so you can move your way through your notes pretty quickly, right? So first, you got to understand 5 key things are going to happen in the later part of the 19th century that are going to be important for us to understand and know, okay? 1, Greece is going to liberate itself. 2, there's going to be a massive amount of liberal reform in Great Britain, which we've already started talking about. You just don't realize it. And what we're going to do is we're going to reference back to the Industrial Revolution a little bit, talk about some of the Mines and Factories Act and stuff like that actually happened during that liberal reform movement, along with some political developments as well. Then another one, the Irish Potato Blight, aka the Irish Potato Famine, which of course I'm sure some of y'all have heard about already. We'll talk about that a little bit in this flip as well. And hopefully we'll get to the end of Restoration France if we can actually get there, which would be amazing. And then we'll move into the revolutions of 1848. Now look, the big thing about it though is those are the topics that we are going to cover, and I just messed this Prezi up, and so I'm not going to have to do this whole thing. But what you need to understand is whatever we get through leading up to your test is what will be on your test. And if we need to clip out a little bit of the back end and shove it into the next unit, it's really not that serious, okay? So don't fret, don't freak out, don't look at that little table of contents and be like, oh, are we going to make it? We're going to make it. I'm going to make sure of it, right? So the guiding perspective going into these 5 things that you need to understand is that all these 5 things are going to lead up to a dramatic moment in European history, the revolutions of 1848. Do me a favor and highlight revolutions of 1848, because this, all those 4 things lead to that, right? So and it's the big moment in where all these political isms are going to come crashing into each other and actual violence will take place, right? Because what's going to happen is all this stuff is leading up to the fact that Europe is going to be hit by a series of simultaneous revolutions, right? Simultaneous as in they're all going to happen all at once. It's going to happen in the same year in 1848. And then also, these revolutions in the long run are going to fail, leaving conservatives in power, but not as much power as they used to have, right? So the conservative power will be weakened, but they'll stay in power, right? And then going into it as well, somehow Great Britain and Russia are virtually untouched by these revolutions, which is absolutely bananas, right? Russia, a lot of it has to do with their geography, their political system, as well as the fact that most of them are still serfs. The other one is Great Britain on the flip side is the exact opposite of that. They're super industrial, they're very economic, and they also did a massive amount of liberal reform to avoid said revolutions going forward, right? So the thing you need to understand now is we're going to start focusing in on the liberation of Greece from the Ottomans, right? So there's a group of people that we have not talked much about in this entire course due to the fact that, one, I just don't have that much time. Two, it's really difficult to talk about Suleiman the Great and the Ottomans while you're talking about European history. And three, the Ottomans are the Ottoman Turks, and that's just who they are, right? So, the thing you need to understand, though, is that the Ottoman Empire around this point in time, going up until about 1923, was this large, right? So, as you can tell, all the stuff in color, that's not the pale yellow on the outside, everything in these different colored areas right here is what, at one point or another, was owned and controlled by what you know as the Ottoman Empire, right? The Ottoman Empire's focal point was what we know as Turkey, right? And its capital city was Constantinople/Istanbul, right? So the thing about it, though, is, as you know, okay, I'm sure you know that Constantinople is now called Istanbul. You know the song. So when Constantinople changed to Istanbul, you have to understand that is going to be the ushering in of the Ottoman Empire, right? Now, actually, ironically enough, the funny thing about it is they didn't even officially change the name until 1930. And so at the time, it was still called Constantinople and stuff like that. But going into it, though, the Ottomans controlled all that area, including somewhere that was historically very European. This area right here, known as Greece, right? Greece, as some of you know from learning in English class and learning about Greek mythology and stuff, is very culturally European. It also has its very, very large role in ancient societies and stuff like that. So Greece wanted to liberate itself from Ottoman control. The era of Romanticism, the era of nationalism, self-determination is beginning to take over. And the Greeks are like, wait a minute, we, Greeks, should not be ruled by the Ottomans because we speak Greek and we have Greek food and we have Greek songs and we have Greek things and we have a Greek history that is all our own. We want to be our own country, right? So the thing you need to understand about it is they're going to try to liberate themselves, and there's going to be several armed conflicts where they rise up against the Ottomans and try to earn their freedom. Now, really quickly, Metternich, who do you think he's going to support in the long run of this whole thing? In the long run of the Greek liberation movement, who do you think Metternich's going to put his hat into? Oh, he supported the Ottomans, of course, right? He supported the Turks because they were conservative. So the big thing is that he actually went over there and tried to help them get their armies together, donated some Austrian forces, tried to help them keep Greece under their thumb to keep this conservative balance of power that he so badly wanted, right? Well, the thing about it was, though, what happened is, write this down, is that the Greek liberation movement became a romantic cause throughout all of Europe. As in, romantics, romantic artists, romantic poets started talking about the Greek liberation movement as if it was the best thing since sliced bread. As in the fact that the Greeks deserved to be the people they wanted to be. There was this very large movement called the Philhellenist movement, where basically it means the Greeks for being Greek, right? And they had so many supporters, including a famous one known as Lord Mother flippin' Byron, right? Lord Byron, who went to Greece to help them liberate themselves, where he would eventually die from an infection that he sustained, not even in battle, but he died in Greece trying to help them liberate themselves. And what a romantic piece this is. Look at Lord Byron adorned in ancient Greek garb, the laurel wreath, the lyre that Greeks used to play in ancient Greece on the floor with its broken strings demonstrating his death, the Parthenon in the background, the ancient Greek motifs, and then also, of course, his club foot covered by the cloak, right? So is he not to be embarrassed? Greece successfully, though, in this whole process, because it became such a large romantic cause, are going to pressure, the Western European countries are going to pressure the Ottomans and the Russians to try and free Greece. And when nationalism is going to get a win, and Greece is going to liberate itself. Now, why is this so important to talk about? It's huge to talk about because it's showing you that classical liberals, socialists, and nationalists are beginning to try and push the boundaries, right? They're trying to push against the conservative empires. They're like, we don't want to be like Ottoman anymore. Wham! And they're getting a win, right? So the thing you need to understand is that they're starting to chip away at this entire conservative foundation, right? It's like, imagine for a moment you're by yourself attacking a castle and all you have is a pickaxe, right? Well, the liberation of Greece is like a really big strike into one of the cornerstones, right? Trying to bring this big old thing down. And it's one of the most important moments in this like liberation movement going forward, right? And then also one of the other biggest things that's going to go down is this is why Great Britain is pretty much untouched by all of these different things, and why an 1848 revolution never really breaks out there, right? It's because excuse me, let me back up there. I'm stumbling over my words because I'm focusing more on the fact that I sound so raspy and weird, and that I sound like I would like smoke 8 packs of cigarettes a day instead of focusing on what I'm trying to say. So let me take a deep breath. Okay, there we go. So, Great Britain will never have an 1848 revolution due to the fact that they had some problems pop up about 30 years before that, and they dealt with them accordingly, right? So we're going to have a massive amount of liberal reform that's going to go down in Great Britain that kind of prevents them or shows and demonstrates how a government should react to the classical liberal movement and how they actually should do their best to help their people. Well, the thing about it is, in Great Britain, in the early 1800s, like right before Napoleon even falls, during all this other crazy stuff, during the Napoleonic Wars, they have problems of their own. The Industrial Revolution has exposed some issues that are going on in Great Britain. One, the landowning aristocrats are still very much in power. The Parliament and all the members of Parliament, for the most part, are landowning aristocrats and like former nobility or very, very wealthy bourgeois members, right? Not bourgeois from France, but you know what I mean, middle class members. And then what's going on, though, is the Industrial Revolution is bringing massive amounts of people into cities at this point, right? Urbanization is taking over, and we have poor people moving into cities. We have other middle-class members moving into cities. So more than ever before, social classes are beginning to interact with one another. And when they interact with one another, problems are being exposed. People are looking at poor communities and being like, why are they not making any money? Middle-class people are like, why don't we have any representatives in Parliament? And issues are abound. And the other big thing about it is they can't even change anything because only 8% of English men were allowed to vote. That is a cripplingly small number. 8% because it was based on money owned, property owned, and wealth accrued, right? So only 8% of men could vote in Great Britain, so they couldn't even get what they wanted accomplished, okay? Now, why is this a problem, right? Or why is all this going to change? It's because the biggest thing about it is this is a huge issue because the French Revolution has done one thing in Great Britain. It has exposed that British aristocrats are afraid of liberal ideas coming to Great Britain because they're benefiting off the craziness that's going on the continent, right? And a big example of that is the Corn Laws, okay? So the aristocrats during the French Revolution, during the Industrial Revolution, are not getting poorer and like funds are not being evenly distributed. They're actually making more money than they ever have before. Now, the Corn Laws is a great example to understand the biggest reason why all these aristocrats were so wealthy and so obnoxious. So what the Corn Laws were is a series of laws. Actually, let's back it up. Let's take a deep breath, okay? The Corn Laws are going to come out in 1815, okay? Now, really quickly, okay? What had happened is there was always a supply of cheap grains in Britain, okay? You could easily get a hold of a cheap loaf of bread and stuff like that in Britain due to the fact that most of the grain in Great Britain was being imported from poorer European countries, right? Before 1815, before all this other stuff, you could get cheap grains from areas like the Ukraine, the modern Ukraine, Russia, and other areas in Eastern Europe where feudalism was still holding on and serfdom was still producing a bunch of cheap grains. By the way, when we say corn laws, we actually mean any grains whatsoever. It's not just corn, okay? So the thing was, though, is that aristocrats didn't make that much money off of the wheat that they grew anymore in the UK because you could get cheaper grain from other places. But then Napoleon shows up. He throws up the continental system, and it becomes impossible for the British to import that cheap grain anymore. So British people have to turn to buying expensive UK grain. Well, that's going to make the aristocrats very wealthy, right? So when the trade embargoes go down after Napoleon's exiled for the first time, what the aristocrats do is they ram several laws through Parliament to try and say that foreign grain can't be imported unless it's an emergency, right? What does this do? It is literally a law created for rich people to make them richer in Great Britain, right? This infuriated the middle class and the working poor because it drove up the costs of their bread and the costs of their food, right? Now, to give you an example of a villainous figure that is apparently emblazoned by the Corn Laws, it's this guy. Ebenezer Scrooge, right? Ebenezer Scrooge, in the entire story of Charles Dickens, actually gets very, very wealthy due to the Corn Laws, right? Because of his usage of banks and his usage of actually taking aristocratic money, holding on to it, and loaning it out to poorer people, right? Ebenezer Scrooge was written specifically by Charles Dickens to show the evils of the Corn Laws and how literally money was corrupting the upper echelons of society, because Charles Dickens was in a group known as the Anti-Corn Law League, right? So going forward, though, the Corn Laws were taking rich people and just making them wealthier. And the middle class people and the workers are having really expensive food that they have to pay for all the time. Now, there are two parties that the only 8% of British people can vote for. And you can vote for either the Tories, who are super conservative, or the Whigs, who are also conservative, but not as conservative, right? So that's the big question. Who do you vote for? Do you vote for the uber conservative, or do you vote for the other pretty much conservative person? Now, the Whigs have been more like reactive during this time period to middle-class liberalism and stuff like that. But this is the point, a turning point, where the middle-class people in Britain have had enough. They're like, this is hot garbage. This is trash. This is crap. I don't like this. It's not fair, right? It's not fair because they get to decide all the laws and they benefit off of it, and none of us can even vote, right? So what happens is there's a massive public demonstration known as the battle, or as the middle class like to call it, the massacre of Peterloo, right? In St. Peter's Field, in no other city than Manchester, England, there was a massive event that went down, right? It's called the Battle of Peterloo. And in 1817, a protest went down, a huge protest where thousands of people came to get rid of the Corn Laws and to try and get universal suffrage and more voting rights for more people in Great Britain, right? A huge protest where thousands assembled demanding their voices to be heard. Now, how did the Tories and Whigs react to this huge protest? They sent a cavalry brigade in to dispel the protest, and 15 people were killed in this protest. The first people killed was a mother and her child. The mother was trampled by the horse, and literally the child was knocked from her arms and literally killed on the bricks underneath St. Peter's Square, right? So now the conservative government of Great Britain has a problem on their hands. You just killed a bunch of innocent people for no apparent reason, right? So the thing about it was the demands that the people had at Peterloo were more suffrage and more representation. Now, why do they refer to this as Peterloo? Because it's an amalgamation of Waterloo, right? Being like, oh, the conservatives will lose, or like, not the conservatives, that the poor middle class, the working class and the middle class are supposed to be like Napoleon in this, and their like efforts were destroyed, right? And what were the things they wanted? They wanted more suffrage or more voting rights. And they just wanted more representation. They wanted better members of parliament. They just wanted better. They just expected better. They just wanted more out of everything. And the immediate results of this are actually going to be even worse. The conservative parliament is going to pass this thing called the Six Acts, which is actually going to prevent public assembly, going to outlaw protests, and it's going to try and get rid of basic freedom of speech, basic freedom of the press, and also basic human rights, right? Well, what the heck, man? This isn't fair whatsoever. And so the liberals are going to continue to protest, and the working class are going to continue to protest. And in the long run, what ends up happening is liberal reform comes through, right? And they pass, finally, the Liberal Reform Bill of 1832. This is passed 1 year before the Factories Act of 1833 is passed. 10 years before the Mines Act of 1842 is passed. Do you see what I'm talking about? These people and their protests and the massacre at Peterloo started the ball rolling on liberal reform coming to Great Britain and giving people more rights and having demands seen, and the middle class is beginning to shift the way that people vote and shift the way people are represented in Great Britain. It increased suffrage by 50%, which only 8% of people could vote, so you only bopped it up like 4 more percent. So 12% of men can now vote in Great Britain, which doesn't feel like a lot, but still, it's moving in the right direction. But the other thing about it, too, is it gave them more representatives. The number one thing that they wanted to get rid of was this thing called a rotten borough, right? And I'm going to explain what a rotten borough is in class because it's very complex and very complicated. But this is all going on while a very young woman is about to take the throne. A young woman is coming into her own during this time period, and she looked like this when she was little. And then she looked like this when she got a little older, but you'll know her best as Queen Victoria, the longest reigning, until Elizabeth II, longest reigning British monarch that had ever been seen. And the woman that would come in to try and push some of these big new industrial reforms and change the face of Great Britain during the 1800s, right? But what we're going to start talking about in class is we're going to start talking about the Irish Great Famine, the Hungry 40s, and of course, the Potato Blight. Do me a favor, go ahead, get this copy down in your notes, the causes, the population growth, the poverty, and we'll talk more about it and expand on that stuff more in class. But I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.